Now, this is a non-binding agreement, and the final agreement will have to get sign-off from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and the federal court. Patty Hajdu is the Minister of Indigenous Services. She's in Ottawa. Hey, Minister, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Just on timing, first off, why make this announcement today if you don't have details concluded to discuss them?
Well, first of all, this agreement in principle is historic. In fact, all parties have signed on to this important piece of work, which lays the foundation for compensation for children that have been harmed through systemic discrimination and racist funding practices, but also lays the foundation for the rebuilding of child and family services for First Nations communities. This is a significant step, considering that 6 weeks ago, of course, we just sat down to negotiate this out of the court. And we're quite thrilled that the parties have been so committed to a negotiated approach to move forward.
And so if the thinking is that a final agreement is expected, I guess, late 2022, you know, of course, the overarching concern is that the compensation announced should get to people who were harmed quickly. And, you know, many may be now thinking, oh, so talks are just going to keep going now. You know, are you keeping that in mind as these negotiations toward a final agreement continue?
Well, to be clear, I think that we'll get to a final agreement earlier than the end of 2022, although compensation may not start flowing until then. The compensation will be delivered through the leadership of First Nations leaders, communities, and organizations to make sure that it meets its goal of being fair, of being equitable, and of course being done in the least traumatic way. And so, again, we'll be working with partners to make sure that when they're ready to begin to unfold that compensation, that there's no barriers in the way from the Government of Canada's side.
So you would have heard Minister Miller today saying the next, and I think the word he used was difficult step, will be indeed mapping out that final agreement on compensation and how it flows to the families. What are the roadblocks that make that step difficult, as he put it?
Well, I think there's a number of questions on the compensation side that we want to make sure that everyone gets right. And that's why that First Nations leadership is so important. We saw, for example, in previous compensation packages for other harms, where compensation, as well-meaning as it can be delivered in a way that's thoughtless, that can be delivered in a way that creates and recreates trauma for people. And that would be the opposite of the goal from my perspective and from the Government of Canada's perspective. So that's why that First Nations design is so important, because, of course, many First Nations leaders and organizations have had experience with previous compensation packages and know exactly what to watch for and what not to inflict on people who are applying for that compensation. On the reform side, of course, these are systems and structures, as well as significant gaps in equity that exist in communities, and those details will really matter to make sure that the intended goal of that reform, which is every First Nations children has a fair chance to succeed, a fair chance to stay in their communities with their families in a culturally appropriate way, that comes to fruition. And so that work will be difficult. The details are, always difficult, but I know that the parties are committed, and we've got a very strong foundation to work from.
For those who are hearing the headlines today, who know that this has been, you talk about negotiations getting down to the nitty-gritty, toward the end of last year, but it's been a long 15-year battle to get to this point. So people who hear that this is non-binding, how do you ensure Indigenous people that this non-binding agreement will truly lead to compensation?
Well, I think, first of all, the agreement in principle, again, is a historic one, and it is signed by all parties. All parties were very thoughtful and were not prepared to sign until they felt that this agreement in principle did, in fact, create a substantial enough roadmap that we would get to the questions of how the reform would unfold and how we would compensate individuals and who would be included in that compensation. So I think by the virtue of the fact that all parties have signed on to this agreement in principle, there there's some comfort that Indigenous people, First Nations people can take in that their voices have been represented, and that the parties that have been fighting for so long have confidence in this approach. That should hopefully give some people comfort that the next step, although obviously difficult, is one that all parties are committed to.
And do you commit to compensation this calendar year?
I commit to compensation as quickly as possible, obviously with the first and foremost point in mind, which is that it needs to be designed by First Nations people in a way that, as I said earlier, inflicts no further trauma and is fair and respects the rights and the experience of First Nations partners.
So there's compensation and there's also reform. What, in your view, does reform look like in actual practical terms?
Well, reform in practical terms will be different for each community, for each family and children's service provider. But ultimately, the overarching word that I think of when I think of reform is equity, it's community, it's family. There were many moving moments during the announcement just a few hours ago. But I will say that the stories of the individuals that allowed their names to be used for the class action lawsuit are ones that I hope all Canadians hear. And I certainly hope that Canadians listen to their friends, their neighbors, and their colleagues and in their own communities about just how harmful these child welfare practices have been and the systemic underfunding of these services that have resulted in families torn apart, in some cases for many generations. So for me, the overarching theme is equity, and that starts actually with the federal government in partnership with provinces and territories to make sure that First Nations families, First Nations children get every fair shot at success, just like non-Indigenous children across this country.
So this is a lot of money, $40 billion. No one debates that. Huge sum. Do you commit to not cutting funding to other services that First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities need because of this settlement?
I said these remarks in the press conference that at the end of the day, if the country wants to avoid price tags like $40 billion for systemic racism and discrimination, then we need to have equity in funding in all of our services. And that's my job as a Minister of Indigenous Services, is to fight for equity for Indigenous communities, whether we're talking about healthcare, whether we're talking about housing, whether we're talking about infrastructure, that equity needs to be there. Now, some of that work happens in partnership with provinces and territories, and that work I will continue to press with my colleagues. But yes, this is a commitment and an acknowledgement that discrimination is not just a wrong from a theoretical perspective, but it causes enormous harm to Indigenous families, to people, and indeed to the future of our country. Our country will be more prosperous when every single citizen in this country, every single Canadian, First Nations person, Indigenous person says, I have a fair chance at success.
Do you believe this does that? Last question. That this, I hate to say it, but fixes the problem, if you know what I mean? Does this resolve? Does this make for that equity? Does this resolve all of those concerns?
I think it's an important step on the way to equity and on the way to resolving a history in this country of colonization and oppression of Indigenous peoples. I think that it is because it has been crafted with Indigenous partners and with advocates who have been working on this file for a very long time, it meets the target of eliminating discriminatory funding and practices within Indigenous children and family services. But I still think there's work to do for all of us at all levels of government in every community. And that's my job as Minister of Indigenous Services, is to stay focused on fighting for Indigenous people.
All right, Minister. Well, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much for the interview.
Yep, that's Patty Hajdu, the Minister of Indigenous Services. Cindy Blackstock has played an integral role in these negotiations, and she joins us in Ottawa. She is the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Cindy Blackstock, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, and I guess I should say congratulations. I mean, there's details to talk about, but this is a big day, correct? Like a huge day.
It is a big day. It's the first time that we've seen the government, for example, acknowledge that the discrimination is ongoing, acknowledge that part of the reform is fixing itself so it doesn't harm other generations of kids, and most importantly, that it needs to provide more services for families at the level of the community and to young people in care and for young adults who are out of care. That needs to happen in order to lessen the discrimination. So there's a plan for moving ahead, and now we just need to implement it.
Are you satisfied at the progress to date? I mean, details to come. Did you expect or want more at this point, or are you okay with where things are at right now?
Well, I would always like to see things implemented sooner than later. Like I'd like to see that prevention funding rolled out ASAP. But at least there's a plan for it to be implemented as of April 1st. And also, we still have opportunities to improve on that by doing work with communities to identify anything that we might have missed that we ought to address as we try to end this discrimination and prevent it from happening again.
So more details still to be worked out before funds are distributed, indeed, until March 31st to finalize the agreement. How do you think what we heard today resonated with those who've been discriminated against by the child welfare system when it's still unclear when that compensation might flow?
You know, I've heard from a lot of youth in care that the best apology is change behavior. And what they mean by that is that the government stops discriminating against kids in ways that separate them from their families, stops giving First Nations less in public services just because they're First Nations, and that the government also compensates them for the harms that were done. I'd like to see that compensation roll out in a very safe way. We have to keep in mind that some of these victims, actually many of them, are still children themselves. So we have to be very careful that we do this in a way that uplifts them and provides the supports that they need.
You had a great quote in your news conference this afternoon. I think you were quoting somebody else. You said, discrimination is when the government doesn't think you're worth the money.
Yeah.
In your view, does this get this country a step closer to ending that discrimination?
It does. And I think the real lesson of this is if we step back and we think about, had the government actually addressed this problem 20 years ago when we costed out the inequalities, and it would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars to fix, but many children would have not lost their childhoods or indeed some of their lives. The fact that government after government kicked this downstream and tried to fight against the litigation instead of fixing the problem means it's now tens of billions of dollars. We need to apply that same lesson to other things like the water crisis, the murdered missing Indigenous women and girls and others, and really have the courage as a country to embrace what hurts, implement the solutions, because when we do that, we not only benefit First Nations children, young people and their families, we uplift the country in a big way too.
As the sides move toward determining the details on compensation, the how much per person, per family, and the when, what are the indicators that the federal government should be looking at as it moves toward that?
Well, one of the things that we need to see is that it pays the $40,000 that the kids have already won through the human rights damages at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. It pays that amount. It also puts the money for children in trust so that that money is available to them when they become adults. And that there's some real thought given to how to structure the payments so that when they're going to vulnerable young people, that they're not deepening that trauma that they may be experiencing. We have, fortunately, worked on a kind of a plan along with First Nations Youth in Care to be able to provide those supports. So we're hoping very much that Canada picks that up and actually implements that as they actually send out the checks for the payment.
The minister was telling us, or reminding us, I guess, that there are signatures on this, but at the same time it's non-binding. Does that term concern you? And you know, to what degree do you see challenges ahead getting it past non-binding into a final agreement?
Right. Well, non-binding is always a challenge, and the test of the government's commitment is whether or not they implement it. One of the things that we're going to be seeking very early in January is a consent legal order so that the monies for post-majority services and prevention, that's actually delivered as part of a binding order. Because we've seen through this litigation, when the Canadian government was found to be discriminating against kids in 2016, ministers came out and welcomed the decision, then they didn't implement it. So we've now had 21 non-compliance and procedural orders against Canada. So although they say that they're changing their behavior, and I hope that that's true, I think having these binding orders and still having the tribunal oversee the implementation of this agreement, I think is very important for children.
Are you confident this will be fully sorted before the end of this calendar year?
I don't know. I actually don't work on fixed dates. I work on change at the level of children. That has always been my guide. If we see them really land these major supports for families and for young people in care on April 1st, that'll be a big step forward. Then we need to see them also withdraw some of their litigation. I mean, the government of Canada has been the one prolonging the litigation by not complying, by filing an appeal in the Federal Court of Appeal on compensation, and by also filing an appeal on capital so that we can actually build buildings to provide these much needed supports in many communities where there's housing crises. So there's some indicators very soon on the horizon that I want to see the government do.
Man, it's been a long process for you.
Yeah.
One of the other things you said today that I thought was quite interesting, you noted that it was necessary for the Canadian public to awaken to this kind of injustice. Do you think that has been achieved through this process?
You know what? I think without the Canadian public kind of asking more questions about what is happening for First Nations children today, I don't think we would have been at this place. But it's too soon for the Canadian public to think that this problem is solved, because no child's life has been changed today. There's good words on paper, but nothing has changed for children. We have to pay attention until that discrimination ends and until the government reforms itself so that it doesn't do this again. Canada has been a repeat offender when it comes to First Nations kids. First through residential schools, then the 60 scoop, and now through the compound hardship of really giving them less money for public services because they're First Nations. So as a public, we have to keep our eye on the ball and make sure they fix themselves so that this does not happen again.
Cindy Blackstock, thank you, and congratulations, and good luck for the coming weeks and months.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, today the federal government and First Nations leaders moved one step closer to finalizing a $40 billion child welfare agreement, one that's been years in the making and that comes because of harm done to generations of children. But there's still work ahead before any funds are actually distributed. Parties will have until March 31st to finalize the agreement. Deputy Grand Chief Bobby Narcisse from Anishinaabe Nation joins us now with his thoughts on today's announcement. He's in Thunder Bay. Deputy Chief, thanks for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me here there, Paul.
So I want to hear your reaction to today's announcement. What do you think? How are you feeling right now?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic. You know, it's been a long time coming in terms of a settlement of this magnitude. We have sought intervener status as Anishinaabe Nation within the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, so it's been a long time coming. And what with the announcement, with the agreement in principle, our chiefs at Anishinaabe Nation, who represent Treaty 5 and Treaty 9 areas, want to ensure that the compensation and the long-term reform included stipulations that really account for remoteness and the actual cost of delivering child and family services within our remote communities.
I know that's a big issue for you and something you've long advocated for in terms of people in remote communities. What is your degree of confidence that that's going to be dealt with appropriately as they get into the weeds on this and sort out the details on how this is going to roll out?
Yeah. Our chiefs within the Anishinaabe Nation have gave us the mandate to take the federal government to task on this, to look at these compensation packages and long-term reform to really reflect the needs of the unique needs of our remote communities. We have unique challenges and they require unique solutions, especially within our communities. We talked about some of the issues regarding COVID response, even right now. Like even Bearskin Lake, one of our First Nation communities that is facing pandemic issues. Like there needs to be more investments in infrastructure and capital, and we have to look at different ways in terms of servicing our children and developing a child and family service support system that is reflective of the true needs of our remote communities. So when you're talking about like this settlement, these discussions within the AIP, it's really important to really know that a dollar is different than in Toronto than it is in Bearskin Lake or Attawapiskat or any of our remote communities. So we want to ensure that the discrimination does not persist. Our remote communities require to be resourced at needs-based level funding in moving ahead. And it's really important that, that's how we, Anishinaabe Nation, got intervener status within this process, and working with all the partners to develop this AIP to ensure that our remote communities in the far north are resourced properly in order to do this important work that needs to happen.
At the end of the day, it's about equity, right? It's about the principle is, equal access to services for everyone, right? Do you see this as a step toward that? Do you see this, as actually getting there at this point? Like, again, details still to be worked out. But does this provide for equity in your view, as it stands?
Yeah, well, we're going to take the federal government to task on this. Like our community members, our chiefs, our leadership, our children that were in care are demanding that happens. And I know that optimism at times is not there with the track record, but with these robust negotiations that's happening, especially with the AIP, we feel that we're at the base camp right now. And now, the work needs to continue where we have to, climb that mountain, with overcoming a lot of those barriers to equity. And that's where the work needs to happen. And as a result of that, especially within the Anishinaabe Nation's work on remoteness and developing a remoteness quotient that looks at quantifying and doing an empirical-based exercise of saying, well, this is what it costs to deliver child and family services in our First Nation communities. And we've been contacted by First Nations across Canada who are in remote situations as well to say, hey, those are some of the areas that we are still going through. The perpetuation of discrimination still exists. So we have partnered with other First Nations across Canada to look at a process where under this AIP, we're able to focus on remote needs, remote challenges, and also come up with community-based solutions to these remote challenges.
I can't tell whether you're optimistic, given where things are at today, or whether you're, in fact, worried that you're not going to get to the finish line.
Can you blame me, Paul? Can you blame me?
Well, no.
That's the thing. We have been through these negotiations before in other sectors as well. And, for the past 6 to 7 weeks, even during the holidays, we've been engaged with the Assembly First Nations and Chiefs of Ontario and the Caring Society and the Mushuam class action court case, and also working with the Indigenous Services Canada. There always is going to be a degree of skepticism when we're moving ahead with this. But you know what? We need to come up with solutions. We owe it to our children. We owe it to our families. We owe it to our leadership as well to ensure that we have community-based action plans and solutions moving ahead. And like I said, the IIP is just one step. There's still a lot of work that needs to happen. And it needs the cooperation and support of all various sectors within our First Nation communities and within government to move this along.
Thank you for all of that. You raised the issue of COVID in your community. I do want to pick up on that before you go, if you don't mind. I know people there are currently grappling with COVID-19. What do you want to see right now on that from the federal government where you are?
I think, we need to have, negotiations like right now, like our First Nations communities demand support like right now. And, why are we always in a case where we're in a perpetual state of crisis and we're always responding to that crisis? We need to really ensure that we're more proactive. We have 49 communities, and we have close to 12 of those communities that do have COVID. And we need to ensure that we're getting boots on the ground. The coordination of services is happening. There's various areas that we need to take a look at, and we need to also take the lead from the First Nation communities. We need to have various levels of government to put boots on the ground. We heard Chief Kamanawattaman from Bearskin Lake say that a lot of my staff, my support staff from my community, are isolated right now. They do have the virus, and they need the capacity right now to have those supports. And that goes the same for a lot of our communities across Anishinaabe Nation territory that do have COVID. We need to have that dialogue right now. We need to have those action plans put in place and boots on the ground to really assist our First Nation communities. Anything from basic needs, things that we take for granted in urban centers. We talk about this within our remoteness work. Even to battle like a cold or flu, like having orange juice or chicken noodle soup. It's quite the challenges within our communities, and the fact that we need that PPE as well. We need those all those different things that we need to follow pandemic protocols and whatnot, and coordinating our health staff going up to our First Nation communities. All those different areas, and we're trying to coordinate all those services as well. And we need the federal government to really step up and take heed and listen to our leadership in terms of how best forward to move ahead with this.
At the end of the day, it's the same principle that applies, isn't it? Equal access to services that are needed. Deputy Grand Chief, thank you for your time. I appreciate all your comments. Thank you.
No, thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me on your show.
That's Deputy Grand Chief Bobby Narcisse in Thunder Bay, Ontario.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.